If you came of age in Britain in the 1950s, you knew the name BSA the way you knew your own street, the badge on a boy's air rifle, the bark of a Gold Star pulling away from the Ace Café at midnight. At its height, the Birmingham Small Arms Company was the largest motorcycle maker in the world, 12,000 strong at Small Heath, 1 in every 4 bikes wearing its badge. It began as 14 gunsmiths in a hotel room and survived everything: the collapse of the arms trade, 2 world wars, a night in 1940 when the bombs came through the roof and killed 53. And still, it kept building. And then, after more than 100 years, the largest motorcycle factory the world had ever seen fell silent, and the name disappeared from the machines. How does a company that armed a nation, ruled a global industry, and outlasted the Luftwaffe simply vanish? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. 14 gunsmiths in a hotel room. In June of 1861, 14 gunmakers sat down together in a Birmingham hotel with a problem they could not solve alone. The Crimean War had exposed them. For centuries, the gunsmiths of Birmingham had worked the old way. Skilled men, hand-fitting every part. A lock from this workshop, a stock from that, a barrel from another. Each piece unique to the gun it went into. It made fine weapons. It could not make them fast. And when the army needed rifles by the tens of thousands, all at once, the trade had watched in something like horror as the government's own factory at Enfield did the job by machine. Parts turned out to a pattern, identical, interchangeable. A rifle assembled from bins of components that fitted any other rifle of the same type. The future had arrived, and Birmingham was on the wrong side of it. So the 14 formed a company to build guns by machinery, the way Enfield did. They called it the Birmingham Small Arms Company. And in doing so, they built the thing that would define everything that followed, the belief that the way to win was scale, precision, and parts that fitted every time. It was the founding faith of the firm. It would build an empire, and decades later, in a handmade racing single, assembled one at a time on a bench by men who knew each engine personally, that same faith would quietly mark the Gold Star for death. The very idea that made BSA great had no room in it for something built by hand. They bought 25 acres of farmland at Small Heath, laid out a road they named Armory Road, and in 1863 opened a factory, a square fortress of a building with a tower at each corner, standing alone in open green fields, as strange and defiant a thing as you could picture dropped into the Warwickshire countryside. A board was elected under a chairman named John Dent Goodman, with men beside him whose names are worth saying once: Joseph Wilson, Samuel Buckley, Isaac Hollis, Charles Playfair. Birmingham trade names: practical men, gunmen. Goodman would steer the company for the better part of 40 years. Their first great order was for 20,000 rifles, bound for the Turkish infantry, and the machines that turned them out came from America, shipped across the Atlantic from the gunstock makers of Massachusetts. The clang of those imported tools ringing out over the fields was the sound of Birmingham catching up with the future it had so nearly missed. But an arms company lives and dies by other men's wars, and when the wars stopped, the orders stopped with them. In the winter of 1878, the demand simply vanished, and the great fortress at Small Heath fell silent, shut for a year, its machines cold, its men sent home. It was the first near death, and it taught the company the lesson it would live by. Never depend on one thing. Never trust a single market to keep the gates open. So they looked for something else to make. In the 1870s, they tried a curiosity called the Otto Dicycle, a peculiar machine with its 2 wheels set side by side rather than one behind the other, which balanced about as well as that description suggests. It was not the answer, but it pointed toward it, because the answer was 2 wheels after all. Just the right 2, arranged the right way. In the 1880s, the bicycle craze swept Britain, and a firm with precision machine tools and men who understood metal could build bicycle parts, then whole bicycles, and BSA did, badging them with the 3 stacked rifles of the Birmingham gun trade. The piled arms, a trademark born of muskets, now stamped on the freewheel of a pushbike. The gunmakers had become something new without ceasing to be what they were. The motorcycle came next, as it did for so many bicycle firms, when someone thought to bolt an engine to the frame. BSA experimented early, in 1903, with a bought-in engine from the continent. But the first true BSA motorcycle, designed and built as one machine, arrived around 1910. It was solid, unglamorous, reliable to a fault, and it sold out 3 years running. Here was the third life. Guns to bicycles to motorcycles, each pivot a survival, each one made possible by the same 25 acres, and the same machines, and the same belief in doing things by the thousand. By the time the old century turned into the new one, BSA was no longer a gun company that made other things. It was becoming an industrial combine. Steel, machine tools, bicycles, cars through its purchase of Daimler in 1910, and motorcycles that were beginning to earn a reputation all their own. The green fields were long gone. The fortress had become a small city, its chimneys smudging the Birmingham sky, its gates swallowing thousands of men each morning and giving them back each night. And it had learned the one lesson that mattered: how to survive anything the market could throw at it. What it had not yet learned was how to fall in love. That would take a rider, an engine, and a single lap of a racetrack in Surrey. Chapter 2. The Gold Star at Brooklands. The Great War made BSA enormous. Behind the walls at Small Heath, the company turned out 1.5 million rifles, Lewis guns by the hundred, shells and fuses without end, and even the world's first folding bicycle, hinged in the middle so a soldier could strap it to his back and drop from the sky with it. A workforce of 6,500 swelled to nearly 20,000, women pouring onto the shop floor to take the places of the men who had gone to fight. The firm that had once bolted its gates for want of a single order now could not build fast enough for the slaughter, and when the guns fell quiet in 1918, BSA did what it always did. It turned back to peace, back to motorcycles, and set about becoming the biggest name in British biking. Through the 20s and into the 30s, the range grew. Sturdy, sensible machines for a nation that wanted cheap, dependable transport. In 1937, a designer named Val Page tidied the whole confusing catalogue into order, and among the machines he rationalised was a sporting 500 called the Empire Star. A good bike, a quick bike, not yet a legend. The legend was made almost by accident on a summer evening in 1937, and it was made at Brooklands. Brooklands was the great banked speed bowl in Surrey, the temple of British motorsport, and it kept an old and jealous tradition. Lap the outer circuit at 100 miles an hour or more, and you were awarded a small enamelled badge, a Gold Star. It was the mark of a genuinely fast man on a genuinely fast machine, and it was not handed out lightly. BSA's competition manager, a shrewd man named Bert Perigo, wanted one for the Empire Star, so he did something quietly audacious. He took a single machine and had it specially prepared. The engine built up by a fitter named Len Crisp, tuned by an engineer named Jack Ammett, given a high-compression piston, hotter cams, a racing magneto for its spark, and set to run on methanol so it could breathe harder than any pump fuel would allow. Then he persuaded a legend out of retirement to ride it. Wal Handley had been one of the finest racers of his generation, a multiple Isle of Man winner who had long since hung up his leathers. Perigo coaxed him back for one midweek meeting, a low-key affair with the grandstands half empty. On the 30th of June, 1937, Handley took the modified Empire Star out onto the great concrete banking at Brooklands and rode 3 laps. He averaged 102 miles an hour. His fastest lap touched 107. He came off the bowl with his Gold Star, and with something worth far more than a badge, because he had just proved that a machine barely removed from a showroom BSA could run with the fastest bikes in the country. BSA saw exactly what it had. The following season it launched a new alloy-engined sports machine built on the lessons of that single lap, and it gave the bike the only name it could possibly carry, a name that held the ghost of that Brooklands badge in every syllable. The Gold Star. It stood on the stand at the motorcycle show that autumn with its alloy barrel gleaming under the lights, and the men who leaned in to look were looking at a road bike with a racing heart. And even then, in tribute to Handley's ride, the racing magneto was part of it, fitted to the very first Gold Star ever sold. Remember that. The magneto was not a component that crept in later, some fussy afterthought bolted on by engineers. It was there at the birth. It was part of the machine's racing soul from the first day it turned a wheel, which is precisely what would make its withdrawal, a quarter of a century on, feel to so many like a knife in the back. Fewer than 500 of those pre-war Gold Stars were ever built. The machine had barely begun its life when history interrupted it, because in 1939 the world went to war again, and BSA went back to the work it had been born for. This time it was total. BSA became the arsenal of the nation. 67 factories, the only rifle plant still operating anywhere in Britain, turning out around 126,000 military motorcycles alone. The plain, rugged, unkillable M20 that carried dispatch riders across every theatre of the war. And because it was the country's arsenal, it became a target. On the night of the 19th of November, 1940, the Luftwaffe found Small Heath. The bombs came down through the roof of the works, and 53 people sheltering behind the blast walls were killed where they stood, aged from 18 to 68. 10 of them women. Ordinary Birmingham lives ended in a few seconds of noise and dark. Nearly 90 more were injured. Rifle production, it was said, stopped for 3 months. In the days that followed, 16 gallantry awards were given to the people who had dug through the wreckage for the living. The company buried its dead, cleared its ground, and because there was a war on and no time for grief, went straight back to arming Britain. And when this war too finally ended, BSA turned once more to peacetime, to motorcycles, and to the unfinished business of the machine named for a badge won at Brooklands. The Gold Star's real life was about to begin, and it would be glorious. Chapter 3. Race on Sunday. Ride to work. Monday. The post-war Gold Star was reborn in 1948, and from the start it was built to do one thing above all: win. It came in 2 sizes, a 350 and a 500, and it was built in numbers small enough that each one mattered. To race in the Clubman's Tourist Trophy, the great amateur event over the Isle of Man mountain course, run on genuine road-going machines. A maker had to build a proper run of them for sale to the public, to homologate in the language of racing. So BSA hand-assembled more than 100 of the new post-war Gold Stars, and in 1949 put 21 of them on the grid for the junior race alone. The idea behind it was simple and irresistible. Build a bike a man could buy from a showroom, ride to work all week, then take to the island and race against the best amateurs in the world. And win. And win it did. The 350 took the Clubman's honours almost from the moment it appeared, and the machine's reputation began to build the way all the best reputations do, by beating people, over and over, until beating them stopped being news and started being expected. Then in the spring of 1949, a man walked through the gates at Small Heath who would turn a fast bike into a perfect one. His name was Bert Hopwood, and he was one of the finest motorcycle engineers Britain ever produced, a designer of rare instinct, trained in the great years of the industry, who understood how an engine breathed the way a doctor understands a pulse. Hopwood took the 500-cylinder head and redesigned it from the ground up, and the improvement was transformative. What had been a strong engine became a genuinely great one. Remember his name, too. 2 decades later, the same Bert Hopwood would be standing in a boardroom at the very end, holding the designs that might have saved the whole company, watching men who understood less than he did decide to wind it all up instead. For now, though, the bike simply got better, year on year, and each version has its devotees to this day. The early swinging arm machines, the duplex-framed bikes of 1953. Then, in 1954, the famous big fin engines, their alloy barrels grown huge and deeply finned to shed the heat of hard tuning. Each one faster, harder, more single-minded than the last. And across the Atlantic, the Americans were watching. In 1954, BSA sent a team to the Daytona Beach Race, 200 miles flat out on the sand, the toughest test in American motorcycling, and the Gold Stars came home 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Not a British win, a British rout. The team had been assembled by an engineer and racer named Roland Pike, and the result announced to the largest motorcycle market on Earth that the fastest single-cylinder machine in the world was made in a factory in Birmingham. But all of it, every frame change, every tuning refinement, every race win, was building toward one final machine. In 1956, BSA released the Ultimate Gold Star, the version that enthusiasts still speak of in hushed tones, the one whose model code became a kind of secret handshake among men who knew, the DBD-34. It was a weapon. Big fin alloy engine, clip-on handlebars that folded the rider down low over the tank, a huge full-width front brake, a close-ratio racing gearbox, a swept-back exhaust, and, the detail every Goldie man will recite from memory, an enormous Amal racing carburettor, an 1.5 inches across the throat, big enough, they used to say, to swallow a sparrow. It would run to 110 miles an hour. It would pull 60 in first gear alone, and it was, by any honest measure, a difficult and demanding machine to live with. That carburettor didn't want to idle. In traffic, at low speed, the plugs would foul and the engine would stumble and load up and threaten to die under you. A Gold Star was not a bike you flattered yourself you'd mastered. It was a bike that demanded you learn its moods. And that was precisely the point. Every DBD-34 came from the factory, with its own test sheet, its own engine run on a dynamometer, its power recorded, its character certified by the men who built it. You didn't buy a Gold Star the way you bought an appliance. You bought a handmade racing machine that happened to be road legal, assembled one at a time on a bench by fitters who knew every part by feel. Race on Sunday, ride to work Monday. It was the truest promise any motorcycle ever made, and the Gold Star kept it. But the very things that made it magnificent, the hand assembly, the racing carburettor, the temperament, the magneto, made it something else too. Something nobody at Small Heath wanted to say out loud while the trophies kept coming. It made it expensive. It made it slow to build. It made it a beautiful anachronism, a handcrafted survivor from an older way of doing things, running flat out into a future that was already being built to a different pattern. For now, though, the trophies did keep coming, and in 1956, the Gold Star would win so completely that it destroyed the very race that made it famous. Chapter 4. The Ton and the Twitter. There is a kind of victory so total it becomes a problem, and in the Clubman's Tourist Trophy of 1956, the Gold Star found it. A rider named Bernard Codd, Bernie to everyone, did something that had never been done. He won both the junior and the senior Clubman's races, the double in the same week, both of them on Gold Stars, the junior at better than 82 miles an hour and the senior at better than 86. The first man ever to take both in a single year, and this on an amateur road course that had already served as a proving ground for future world champions. Men like Jeff Duke and Bob McIntyre had ridden these same Clubman's races on their way up, but around Codd, the leaderboards told the real story. In the Clubman's races of the mid-50s, the Gold Star didn't merely win. It filled the results from top to bottom, like a signature written across the whole event. In one race that decade, 33 of the 37 riders on the grid were mounted on Gold Stars. Eddie Dow, who would go on to become the great keeper of the Gold Star flame, took the senior Clubman's himself on a 500 around the middle of the decade. And that was the trouble. A race is a contest between makes, a spectacle of rivalry, and when one machine wins everything, the rivalry dies. There was nothing left to watch. The organisers looked at a race in which every serious entry rode the same Birmingham single, and after 1956, they quietly killed the Clubman's Tourist Trophy altogether. The Gold Star had won so absolutely that it made its own race pointless. It is a strange sort of epitaph, to be discontinued not for failing, but for winning too well. But by then, the Gold Star had already escaped the racetrack and found a far bigger stage, out on the open road, in the hands of young men who had never entered a race in their lives and never would. This was the age of the café racer, and the Gold Star was its king. Up and down the new arterial roads of Britain, and above all at the Ace Café on London's North Circular, a generation of working-class boys in black leather had discovered something intoxicating. A fast British single, a stretch of empty dual carriageway at midnight, and the simple, dangerous ambition of the tune. 100 miles an hour, the magic number, the line that separated the boys who talked from the boys who did. They called themselves the Ton-Up Boys, and later the Rockers, and the Gold Star was the machine they dreamed of. Strip it down, fit clip-on bars and rear-set footrests and a Dunstall pipe that split the night in two, and you had the definitive café racer, the bike to beat, the one every other rider measured himself against, until the home-built specials arrived to challenge it. When the fastest of those specials appeared, a Triumph twin in a Norton frame, the machine they called the Triton, even that was, in a sense, a compliment to the Goldie. You built a Triton because you were trying to beat a Gold Star. The ritual was its own small poem. Drop a coin in the jukebox, pick a record, Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, something fast, then bolt out of the car park and race to an agreed point and back before the song finished. Rock and roll on the North Circular, the bark of the single off the underpass walls, the twitter on the overrun as you backed off for the roundabout, and then home before the last chord faded, or not home at all, because the ton was a real number and the roads were real roads, and not everyone came back. From the Ace to the Busy Bee, the same faces, the same machines, the same hunger. It was youth and speed and noise and freedom, bound together so tightly that clubs grew up around it. Chaplains among them, the men who would become the famous 59 Club, began their work in exactly this world. And when the filmmakers came to put that world on the screen, in the 1964 picture, The Leather Boys, it was these bikes and these cafés they reached for, because there was simply nothing else that meant the same thing. Eddie Dow understood what he was looking at better than anyone. He built a whole business in Banbury around keeping Gold Stars running and making them better, parts, tuning, expertise, a shrine to a single model. And the Goldie needed men like Dow, because the factory that built it was already, quietly, beginning to look elsewhere. The bike's meaning had outgrown the company that made it. It had become a symbol of a certain kind of Britain, a certain kind of young man, a certain brief moment when the fastest thing on the road was hand-built in Birmingham. The riders couldn't see it, roaring through the night with the record still playing, but the ground was already shifting under them. The machine they worshipped was a masterpiece from a world that was ending, and the company that made it stood in these very same years at the absolute summit of its power, bigger, richer, and more dominant than any motorcycle firm had ever been. It could see everything from up there. Almost everything. Chapter 5. 1 in 4 is a BSA. Stand at Small Heath in the early 1950s and you were standing at the top of the world. The scale of it is hard to hold in the mind now. In these years, BSA built somewhere around 75,000 machines a year, exported them to every corner of the earth, and stood, after it swallowed its old rival Triumph in 1951, as the largest motorcycle manufacturer on the planet. Not the largest in Britain, the largest anywhere. The works itself sprawled across more than 1 million square meters, employed more than 12,000 people at Small Heath alone, and had grown so vast that walking from one end of a single shop to the other and back really did cover close to 2 miles. There was a slogan, and everyone knew it. 1 in 4 is a BSA. 1 in every 4 motorcycles on the road, carrying the 3 piled rifles of a Birmingham gun company. Walk into one of those shops at the height of a shift, and the noise took you by the throat. The massed clatter of thousands of machine tools, belts and lathes and presses running together. A sound so constant that the men who worked inside it stopped hearing it altogether and noticed it only in the strange ringing quiet after the hooter blew. At the far end, finished machines rolled off the line and were crated for the docks, for Australia, for South Africa, for India, for 100 markets that took the Birmingham name as a guarantee of a thing well made. This was not a workshop, it was an industry, humming at a pitch that felt as though it could never wind down. It was a machine for making machines. During the war, the motorcycle lines had run at 1,000 finished bikes a week, one rolling out complete, on average, every 5 minutes of every working day. That capacity did not vanish with the peace. It turned instead to feeding a hungry post-war market that wanted cheap, dependable transport, and wanted it now. And BSA fed that market as no one else on earth could. The man at the top, through the structural high watermark, was Jack Sangster, a canny industrialist who had sold Triumph to BSA and then risen to the chairmanship of the whole group, a figure who understood the business as well as anyone alive. Under men like him, the empire looked not merely successful, but permanent, invincible even. A great pillar of British industry, armed by history, enriched by 2 wars, dominant in its markets, its name a household word from Birmingham to Bombay. And that is the cruel thing about summits. From the top, the view is magnificent, and the ground looks a very long way down, and it is almost impossible to believe you are standing on the edge of anything at all, because the seeds were already in the soil. The Gold Star that filled the winner's circle was a hand-built anachronism the company had already, in its quieter strategic moments, decided not to modernize. The plant was aging. The conglomerate had sprawled into 100 things it half understood, and far away, in a country BSA barely thought about, a small firm was building a different kind of motorcycle, clean, cheap, reliable, made by machines that never tired, and learning to build them faster than anyone in Birmingham imagined possible. Its name was Honda, and in the early 50s, nobody at Small Heath had any reason to fear it at all. The men walking the 2-mile length of those shops past the benches where the gold stars were built one at a time, could not have known that they were living through the last good years. The trophies were still coming. The export crates were still leaving. 1 in 4 was still a BSA. But this was the peak, the highest point before the fall. And standing at that summit, in the noise of 10,000 machine tools and the certainty of a company that had survived everything the century had thrown at it, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff that they were about to walk off. Chapter 6. The Future in the Wrong Hands. The trouble with a summit is that every direction from it leads down, and BSA, standing at the very top of the world, could not tell which way it had already begun to fall. The first shift came dressed as a triumph. In 1951, BSA bought Triumph, its great rival, the maker of the fast, handsome twins that half of Britain lusted after, for £2.5 million. Jack Sangster, who owned Triumph, sold up partly out of fear of what death duties might one day do to his family, and took a seat near the top of the BSA empire as part of the deal. On paper, it was a masterstroke, the two biggest names in British motorcycling, under one roof at last. In practice, it planted a rivalry inside the company that never truly healed. Triumph had its own factory at Meriden, its own fierce pride, its own way of doing things, and it did not think of itself as a junior partner to Birmingham. Two proud marques, two proud factories, now made to share a single future, and, quietly, to compete for it. The seeds of the final unravelling were sown in that very deal, 20 years before the flowers of it came up black. The man who came to embody that future was Edward Turner. Turner was the genius behind the Triumph Twin, the most influential British motorcycle designer of his age, a hard, brilliant, difficult man. In 1956, he took charge of the whole automotive division, and he pointed the entire group in one direction, toward unit construction, the engine and gearbox cast as a single compact unit rather than bolted together from separate lumps. It was the modern way, the cheaper way, the way the whole industry was already going. Men beneath him, like the general manager Bob Fearon, drove the redesign of the twins along exactly those lines, and in principle, they were right to. Unit construction was the future. The tragedy was never that BSA embraced it. The tragedy was what it chose to leave behind. And here is where the Gold Star's fate was quietly sealed, years before anyone in Birmingham had heard the word magneto used in anger. Because unit construction cost money to design, and BSA spent that money where it saw a future. In 1958, it launched the C15, a neat little unit construction 250 derived from Turner's Triumph designs, a learner's bike, cheap and clean and modern, the kind of machine a young man bought to pass his test and get to work. That small engine was the seed of everything that followed. It would grow, through the B40 and the Victor and beyond, into the whole family of road and off-road singles that carried the company through the 60s. BSA was building its future around it, and it made a decision, never announced, never dramatized, simply arrived at in the ordinary way that fatal decisions usually are. It would not spend that kind of money on the Gold Star. The Goldie was pre-war architecture, hand-built, expensive, slow to make and hard to sell in the numbers the accountants wanted, magnificent and finished. The future was being cast in aluminium a few benches away, and there was no place in it for a machine assembled one at a time by men who knew each engine by feel. Then came Lucas. The great electrical firm that supplied half the British industry looked at its own business in the late 1950s and made a perfectly sensible decision of its own. It would wind down the separate magnetos and dynamos of the old world and move to modern alternator and coil ignition. This was not aimed at the Gold Star. It reshaped everyone. It was the very reason BSA and Triumph had to redesign their twins with coil ignition, the machines that became the A50 and the A65. The industry adapted. The Gold Star, alone, was left out of the adaptation because the company had already decided it wasn't worth adapting. Meanwhile, the ground was shifting beneath the whole enterprise. The Gold Star had never been only a road and circuit machine. In the scrambles, out on the rough, the big single had been a king in its own right, hauling itself over the mud and the ruts with a great fistful of low-down torque that no rival could match, ridden to championships by men who could tame it. But that arena was changing fastest of all. Off the road, in the dirt, the future now belonged to light two-stroke machines. Nimble, cheap, easy to throw about, forgiving where the Goldie was demanding, that a heavy four-stroke single simply could no longer follow up a muddy hillside. The scrambler that had been unbeatable became, almost overnight, an old warhorse in a young man's sport. On the racetrack, meanwhile, the future belonged to multi-cylinder engines that left the big singles gasping behind them, and the ordinary British working man who had once dreamed of a Gold Star was, more and more, buying a small, cheap car instead. A Mini, perhaps, and keeping his family dry on the way to work. The market that had built the Gold Star was quietly dissolving, from every side at once, but the storm that would drown them all was gathering somewhere BSA barely thought about. In 1959, a Japanese firm opened its doors in America under the name American Honda, and a few years later, it hung a slogan over the whole Western world: "You meet the nicest people on a Honda." It sold a small machine called the Super Cub, clean, cheap, reliable, with an electric starter and, unimaginably, no oil dripped onto the garage floor. It was everything a British bike of the old school was not, and it was built, it would turn out, at a rate no one in Birmingham could conceive of. By around 1963, Honda alone was building more motorcycles than the entire British industry put together. A later study laid the numbers bare. The British share of the American market would collapse from nearly half in 1959 to under 1 in 10 by 1973, and where a Honda worker turned out more than 100 machines in a year, a British workman managed something closer to 10. It was not that the men at Small Heath were lazy. It was that they were being asked to fight a modern war with the tools of an older one, and no one at the top had yet grasped that the war had even begun. Nobody at Small Heath was afraid yet. That was the tragedy of it. The trophies were still coming, the crates were still leaving, and the men who ran the largest motorcycle company on earth had every reason to believe they always would. Chapter 7. Slumberglade Hall. Now we come to the decisions themselves, the ones the Fury remembers and the ones it forgets. Start with the one everyone knows. In the early 1960s, Lucas confirmed it was ending production of the competition Magneto, the racing Magneto that had been part of the Gold Star from its first day at the motorcycle show, and BSA, faced with a choice, made the one it had effectively made years before. It could re-engineer the Goldie's lower end to take modern coil and alternator ignition, a considerable expense, the engineers reckoned, for a machine built by hand, in small numbers, losing money in every market it had once ruled. Or it could simply stop. It stopped. In 1962 and 63, the last Gold Stars left Small Heath, and the greatest sporting single Britain ever built was allowed to die. There would be no true replacement for the sporting single from the factory for the best part of a decade. Here is the line every Gold Star man knows, handed down for 60 years. It is said that when the American distributor Hap Alzina pressed BSA to keep the bike alive, someone at the top replied that if Alzina wouldn't buy what they wanted to make, they would stop making what he wanted to buy. Whether anyone ever truly said it, no one can prove. The Owners' Club itself files the story under "It is believed," but it has survived 6 decades because it captures a feeling that was entirely real. The feeling of being brushed aside. The feeling that the men in the boardroom didn't understand or didn't care about. The thing they were killing. And the Fury is right about the feeling. It is only wrong about the mechanism. The honest truth is quieter and sadder than the legend. The Gold Star did not die because one executive lost his temper over a spark. It was, by then, an outdated machine by every cold measure the accountants could name, pre-war in its bones, expensive to build, beaten in the dirt and on the track, and increasingly on the road as well. The cost of dragging its lower end into the modern age was real, and for a low-volume machine the company had already resolved not to develop. It made no commercial sense at all. The withdrawal of the Magneto did not kill the Gold Star. It simply handed BSA the excuse to finish off a bike it had long since decided to let go, and no one at the factory built a replacement. That job fell to the faithful, to men like Eddie Dow, who by now ran a whole business in Banbury devoted to the Goldie, and who bolted the company's own twin-cylinder engine into Gold Star cycle parts to create the machine they called the Rocket Gold Star, a stopgap, a love letter, a way of keeping the flame burning from the outside because the factory had let it gutter out on the inside. The men who loved the bike went on making it, in spirit, long after the men who owned it had walked away. For the dealers who had built their names on the Gold Star, and the riders who had saved for one, the ending arrived without ceremony. No last-off-the-line photograph, no speeches. The greatest sporting single in the country was simply no longer in the catalogue, and the men who wanted one were told, in effect, to look elsewhere, or look backwards. A whole culture, the clubman's, the scrambles, the café racer dream, had been quietly deprived of the machine at the centre of it, and told nothing at all about why. That was 1963. Hold the date, because the company itself would run on for another 10 years, and the men who really killed it had not yet made their worst mistakes. In 1964, Edward Turner retired. Bert Hopwood, the engineer who had made the Gold Star's engine great and one of the ablest men in the entire industry, hoped for the top job. He did not get it. It went instead to a dynamic outsider named Harry Sturgeon, a man from the aircraft industry with real drive and real charm, who grew the group's turnover by something like 40% and threw his weight behind a bold new machine, a 3-cylinder superbike, the Trident, the Rocket 3, designed by Hopwood and Helly, a genuine world-beater in the making. For a moment, there was momentum again. For a moment, it looked as though the company might yet find its feet. And then, in 1966, Harry Sturgeon was diagnosed with a brain tumour, and shortly afterward, he died. Who knows what might have been had he lived? It is one of the great unanswerable hinges of this whole story. Instead, the job passed to another man from the aircraft world, Lionel Joffé, and under Joffé the company made the decision that money and hindsight would both come to regret. He built a shrine to engineering and set it as far from the factory floor as he could. It was a country house at Umberslade Hall, turned into a grand group research centre. Some 300 staff, something like £1.5 million a year to run. Gleaming, modern, panelled and physically separated by miles of Warwickshire lanes from the grimy Birmingham shops where the actual motorcycles were actually built. The idea was to modernise, to centralise the brains of the operation in one place, to give the engineers room to think. What it produced, in practice, was a body of designers cut off from the men who made things, dreaming up products in comfort while the Japanese poured their money into the unglamorous art of production engineering, into the science of building things faster and better and cheaper. The workforce had a name for the place, and the name told you everything you needed to know. They called it Slumberglade Hall. Bert Hopwood despised it. He had tried to resign the moment Joffé was appointed over him. The chairman, Eric Turner, had refused to accept the resignation and kept him on, and he watched the whole expensive folly unfold with the contempt of a man who knew better and could not stop it. Years later, he would set it all down in a book, whose title is itself an indictment. Whatever happened to the British motorcycle industry? And out of Slumberglade came the disaster that broke BSA's back. In the late 1960s, Edward Turner, coaxed out of retirement, designed a small overhead cam twin, a machine that carried the names Bandit and Fury. Hopwood and Doug Hell, another of the fine engineers the company still somehow possessed, worked to refine it. It was shown to the public late in 1970, to real excitement. And then, with the money running short, it was cancelled before a single one reached the showrooms. A promise made and withdrawn in the space of a season. Worse followed. For 1971, the group reframed its entire twin range around a new oil-bearing chassis, a frame that carried the engine oil inside its own tubes, designed at Umberslade, far from the shop floor and far from the men who would have to build the bikes on it. There were bright spots in the range, real ones. The American designer Craig Vetter styled a dramatic machine called the Hurricane. Test riders like Percy Tate wrung genuine performance out of the new triples. But when the oil-in-frame chassis finally reached the factory, late, it didn't work. The Triumph engines wouldn't drop into the new frames in one piece. They had to be dismantled to fit, an assembly line nightmare. And the frame stood so tall that the finished machine carried a seat 34 inches off the ground. 34 inches. Too high for a great many ordinary riders to get a foot down at a standstill on a range of bikes aimed squarely at ordinary riders. It was a modernisation that insulted the very customers it was built to win, arriving late into a market Honda had already taken and would not give back. And still the company pressed on. Late in 1971, it launched 13 new and revised models at a lavish gala in London. Champagne, floodlights, optimism poured out by the case. A company trying to do far too much, far too fast, With money it no longer had. The confidence on display that night was almost the most tragic thing of all, because the men raising their glasses could not see, or would not see, that the accounts behind the celebration had already turned to red. There is a bitter footnote to it too, in the one machine that should have been the group's salvation. The Trident Triple, Hopwood and Healy's three-cylinder masterpiece, was a genuinely world-class motorcycle, fast and fine and admired. But it reached the market slowly, and it reached it at almost the exact moment Honda unveiled a machine of its own, a smooth four-cylinder superbike, electric-started, sensibly priced, built in numbers the British could only dream of. Against that, even a brilliant British triple struggled to be heard. The company had, in the Trident, done something magnificent, and had still contrived to be a step behind. That was BSA at the end, capable of greatness, and somehow always half a beat too late to be saved by it. BSA had, at that very moment, in Hopwood and Healy, two of the finest engineers in the world, and a drawer full of ideas that might have carried it into the 80s. It had instead a boardroom that spent a fortune on the wrong things and would not back the right ones. The magneto was never the disease. This was the disease, and by now it was terminal. Chapter 8. The Ignominious Defeat. The numbers came due in 1971. BSA's motorcycle business lost around £3 million that year. The wider group's losses ran deeper still. The great firm that had survived the Crimean slump, 2 world wars, and the Luftwaffe was, quite simply, running out of money. It was not alone. All around it, the British motorcycle industry that had once ruled the world was folding in on itself, mark by mark, as the Japanese took market after market. But BSA had been the biggest of them all, the flagship, the one that was meant to be too large to fail. And when the biggest begins to sink, it pulls a great deal down with it. On the 16th of July, 1971, the company announced that roughly 11% of the 7,000 people in its motorcycle division would have to go. Some 770 jobs, the first of many. Behind that percentage were men who had given the place their whole working lives, fathers who had followed their fathers through the gates, households on the streets around Armory Road where more than one wage came out of Small Heath. 11% is a clean, bloodless figure. What it meant was letters and silences at the tea table and the particular dread of a family that has heard the word redundancy and knows more of it is coming. Around the same time, Lionel Joffe left. He was paid £35,518 to terminate his contract. Set those two facts beside one another, and you need no narrator to tell you how it felt on the shop floor. The chairman, Eric Turner, disclosed a £10 million overdraft, and then he too was gone, replaced at the top by a distinguished lawyer, Lord Hartley Shawcross, a man brought in to manage a decline rather than reverse it. The workers did not go quietly at first. On the 14th of October, 1971, they demonstrated. George Evans, of the National Union of Vehicle Builders, drew a line in public. They would not tolerate the serving of notices to their members. Word had come down from the Clyde, where the shipbuilders had seized their own yards in a work-in that had captured the nation, and the men of Small Heath voted to do the same. To occupy the plant, to keep the machines running, to refuse to accept that a company older than any of them was simply going to be switched off. It collapsed within a week. There was no long tradition of that kind of fight at Small Heath, no deep root of militancy to draw on when the moment came, and the resolve drained away almost as quickly as it had risen. The first 870 sacked workers collected their wage packets and walked out through the gates for the last time. One who was there called it an ignominious defeat, not a battle lost, a battle barely joined. The wage packets collected in near silence. The clocking off that would not be followed by a clocking on. That was how 60 years of a man's working world ended, not with a siege, but with a queue and an envelope and the walk home. Umberslade Hall, Slumberglade, the great expensive folly, was closed in January 1972. By then, the group's debt had reached something like £22 million, and through it all, the making of the motorcycles was ebbing away from Small Heath itself. Final assembly had already begun drifting to the Triumph plant at Meriden. The lines that had once turned out a finished machine every few minutes now ran slower and shorter, and in places not at all. A great works does not die the way a man dies, all at once. It dies the way a fire dies, furnace by furnace, shop by shop, each one going cold and quiet while the ones beside it still burn, until one day a man looks up from his bench and realizes the heat has gone out of the whole place and it is not coming back. And so, in the end, it came to the government. In the autumn of 1972, a man named Dennis Poor was summoned to the Department of Trade and Industry. Poor ran Norton Villiers, one of the last pieces of the British industry still standing. Lord Shawcross told him plainly what the position was. BSA could not meet its obligations. Barclays was ready to send in a receiver, and the whole enterprise would fall unless something was done. The Heath government would step in with help, but only on one condition. BSA and Triumph would have to merge with Norton Villiers to survive. The rescue came. In 1973, a new company was formed to hold what remained, and it was called Norton Villiers Triumph. Read that name again. Norton Villiers Triumph. There is no BSA in it. In the paperwork of a government rescue, the oldest and proudest name in the whole story. The name of the 14 gunsmiths, of 1.5 million rifles, of 1 in 4 bikes on the road, simply vanished. There was no room in the new firm's title for the 3 piled rifles of Birmingham. BSA, as a maker of motorcycles, was gone, not defeated in the market, erased in a merger, and even that rescue carried the seeds of more grief. Poor's plan to concentrate what was left triggered the long, bitter sit-in of the Triumph workers at Meriden, an 18-month stand that would become a saga in its own right. The full losses, when Poor came to count them, ran to something like £16 million in the period to the summer of 1973. But the cruelest detail is not a number. On the very day the board sat down to wind up BSA motorcycles, Bert Hopwood and Doug Heeler were in the building, presenting a plan. It was a modular range, a whole family of machines, singles, twins, triples, sharing common parts, designed from the outset to be built efficiently the way the Japanese built, engineered by the 2 finest men the company still had. By the account Hopwood himself set down in his book, it was a range that could have carried BSA into the 1980s and let it fight the war it was losing. They laid it before the board on the same day the board decided there would be no more BSA to build it. Picture that room. The drawings on the table, the 2 engineers who had given the firm the Gold Star's great engine and the mighty Trident, offering it one more chance, and the men across the table, choosing instead to end it. The company that had survived the collapse of the Victorian arms trade, and 2 world wars and a night in 1940 when the bombs came through the roof, was not killed by a spark, not by a Japanese factory, not even by bad luck. It was wound up in a meeting room by men who were handed a future and chose, instead, to switch off the lights. Chapter 9. The 2-mile shop falls. Silent Small Heath did not close in a single day. That would have been too clean, too merciful. It ended the way these places usually end, in stages, over years, each one taking a little more until there was nothing left to take. Motorcycle assembly had already been shifting away to Meriden. Poor's plan to consolidate the industry there set off its own long agony, an 18-month sit-in by the Meriden workers that would become a famous chapter of its own. And through it all, the manufacturing at Small Heath wound down toward nothing until the last of it was finished off in the middle of the decade, and the great works fell silent for good. Then the demolition men came. The vast reinforced concrete buildings, one of them, when new, an early landmark of concrete construction in the whole of Britain, a thing engineers had come to study, came down across the 1970s. The 3 great blocks, the shops 60 feet wide, the towers at the corners, the benches where the Gold Stars had been built one at a time by men who knew every part by feel, all of it cleared and carted away, load by load, until the map of Birmingham had a hole in it the exact shape of a company that had once armed a nation. Count the human cost in the only figures that hold it. The workforce that had peaked at 28,000 souls in 1945 had fallen to around 3,700 by 1973. Behind that fall were households, streets, whole lives, organised for generations around the hooter and the wage packet and the gates at the end of Armoury Road. The skill went with them. When a works like that closes, it does not simply put men out of a job. It scatters a body of knowledge that took a lifetime to build, the feel for metal, the touch on a lathe, the ear for an engine, the 1,000 things a place teaches that were never written down. Some of the men found other work, some never really did, and the particular craft of building a gold star by hand, on a bench, to a test sheet, walked out of the gates in the pockets of aging men and did not come back. Today, a firm mends taxis in a surviving works building from 1915. A chemical company runs a plant on part of the ground, and BSA Guns, a separate concern keeping the old name alive, still proofs air rifles at Armory Road, next door to the ghost of the factory that made the military rifles by the million. Sporting guns, proofed where the arsenal of a nation once stood. There is a strange, quiet music in that, and the dead of 1940 are still remembered, though not, for a long time, on the ground where they fell. The 53 who died behind the blast walls that November night are named in the city, among the lost recorded on the Tree of Life Memorial unveiled in Birmingham in 2005, and on the Roll of Honour kept for the city's air raid dead. But the works itself carried no memorial to them for decades. It was only in 2010, 70 years on, that a man named John Price and a small band of the faithful laid a wreath at Armory Road, the first, it is said, to be laid there in 70 years. 7 decades, and the men and women who died making rifles for Britain had to wait that long for a single wreath on the pavement outside. The name did not die with the place. The rights to it passed from hand to hand down the long years, through liquidations and small revivals, and one brief, half-forgotten attempt to build a Gold Star badge machine again, until in 2016 an Indian company, Classic Legends, part of the great Mahindra Group, bought them and set about doing what Birmingham in the end could not. In 2021, a new BSA Gold Star was launched, a modern machine built in England wearing the oldest badge in British motorcycling. The circle closed, but it closed a long way from Small Heath, under a flag the 14 gunsmiths in that hotel room could never have imagined, and it closed on a bike that shares with the original only a name and a longing. Chapter 10. What remains? What remains in the end is not the factory. It is the feeling. The factory is gone, and the company is gone, and the boardroom that switched off the lights is gone with them. But the Gold Star itself refuses to die. There is an owners' club that has kept the flame burning for decades, tracing histories, sharing knowledge, holding the machines in trust for the next hand. Of the 15,000 or so Gold Stars ever built, several thousand were the DBD-34, the ultimate machine, and they are cherished now the way relics are cherished, hunted and restored and known by their numbers. A good one is worth a small fortune, 5 figures without effort, because there will never be any more of them, and everyone who loves them knows it. They are kept alive by people, as they always were. In Norfolk, a specialist named Phil Pearson remanufactures Gold Star parts from scratch, down to the crankshafts, making by hand the pieces of a machine the factory stopped building 60 years ago, so that the bark of the single can still be heard at a rally on a summer morning. At Brooklands, where it all began, the museum keeps a replica of Wal Handley's Empire Star, the machine that won the Gold Star that gave the legend its name. And somewhere in the record collections of the faithful there is a song, simply called BSA, written in 1980 by a Birmingham man who understood exactly what his city had lost. The fury has never really faded, and perhaps it never should. But it is worth understanding what the fury is really made of. It has always been aimed at the magneto, at the one small mistake, because a single mistake is a thing the heart can hold. It is easier to be angry at a decision about a spark than at the slow truth, that a great company lost its nerve and its way and its faith in the thing that had made it great, and that the Gold Star was simply the first beautiful thing it let fall. The magneto myth endures because the bike deserved so much better than the death it got. That much is entirely true. Stand on Armory Road now, on a cold morning, and there is almost nothing to tell you what was here. No 2-mile shop, no 1,000 machines a week, no young man in leather bolting from the Ace Café with a record still playing. Just a quiet Birmingham street, and a firm mending taxis, and an old name on an air rifle works, and the traffic passing over ground that once shook to the largest motorcycle factory the world had ever seen. But close your eyes, and if you ever heard it, you can hear it still. The hard bark of a big single settling to its work. And then, as the throttle closes, that strange and beautiful clatter, the old hands called the twitter on the overrun, the sound of the fastest thing on the road, made by hand, in Birmingham, and gone.